Is there a part of you that thinks that there's an expiration date on you living your dream life? Like, if it didn't happen by 35 or 45 or 55, then it's probably not going to happen and you should just accept what is. Then today's guest is going to blow that idea out of the water for you. In her mid-50s, Sue Camaione was in an abusive marriage and she was trying to find the courage to get out and file for divorce. From the outside, it probably looked like her chances for living her dream life were behind her. But now, almost 20 years later, in her late 60s and 70s, Sue Camaione is living the type of life that many 35-year-olds, including me when I was 35, would be envious of. She's energetic and full of life. She's pursuing many creative pursuits. She just got married to her longtime flame, whom she reconnected with after she got divorced. She's learning the drums. She's practicing Buddhism. She's trying magic mushrooms. She's traveling. She's in writing groups. And she just fulfilled a lifelong dream at the age of 69 by publishing her first book, a memoir about her own life and the double standards that she faced as a woman. If anything, Sue's life is just getting started. She's just beginning to live her dream life, and she just turned 70. And you can tell in this interview she has a lot more ahead of her. So if you want proof that it's never too late, and no matter where you are in your life, things can always get much, much, much better. No matter how old you are, you're not going to want to miss this. So let's go. This is Sue Camaione. She is the recent author of The Practical Seductress, a sex memoir that she wrote in her 60s, I believe at the age of 69. But her entire life is really filled with reinvention after reinvention. So we're just going to dive in and see where this interview takes us. So thank you, Sue Camaione.
Well, thank you, Hannah, for having me.
Yes. So where are you and what's the view outside your window?
I am outside of Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland. I have been very lucky because I recently got married to my longtime lover, and he is a Chilean architect. And because he's an architect, we have light everywhere. So it's like a cathedral ceiling in a very small house with cathedral ceilings and green, as you can see, green everywhere. So,
And I see your drums behind.
I
You've also learned, you're learning how to play the drums at the age of 60-something, which I think is awesome. We'll be talking about that. So you seem to have a very bohemian lifestyle vibe life. Have you always been like this? Has this always been kind of the natural way that you are, or was that a change that you went through?
I think I had a natural way of being very outgoing. I became extremely introverted at one point when I was a child, and there have been times in my life where I withheld myself and my voice and my abilities because in order to fit in order to continue to survive. And that I've sort of cast aside in the last decade. It's just particularly in the last few years, I've decided that it's time to be a voice, not just for myself, but for a lot of other people who don't have a voice.
Yeah. And when we first got in contact, my podcast is about women who've reinvented themselves. The first reinvention story that you talked about was writing a book during COVID in your 60s. You decided to write a sex memoir about the sexual double standard of women and men. And this book is called The Practical Seductress. So that was the first reinvention story. But speaking with you, you actually have kind of lots of reinvention stories. If I had to ask you, what's your reinvention story? What would you say in a nutshell if someone asked you that question?
I think that I have a huge need to express myself and to travel and to see things that are not in the norm. I like to challenge myself, and I ended up in some very dangerous situations. And for instance, being assaulted one time in Mexico and some other places. And so I have the adventurous soul, but yet I also have become very careful and cautious at times in my life, knowing that that could be a dangerous path. But despite that all, I think the thing that probably keeps me going the most is that I do have a very high degree of sexual desire and passion. And it has gotten me into a little bit of trouble here and there. But I think that one thing that has changed for women in the United States is that they've lost the agency and authority over their own bodies. And I really think that the bottom line of that is that there is an authority that does not want women to seek pleasure and to feel desire and passion. And that's really, to me, that's the bottom line of what's happening. That's why the sexual double standard became as I was writing the book, I didn't even know what the theme was. I just knew that I had certain funny stories and certain difficult stories. But at one point, as I read through the entire thing, I realized it wasn't just about the pursuit of an education, a pursuit of freedom, pursuit of equality, but it really was how to overcome and deal with the sexual double standard that so many women throughout the world still suffer through every day.
Absolutely. And just adding your voice and your experience, and through sharing your own experience, that can validate other women who are younger than you and maybe going through something similar. And I do want to talk about how you got to this point of wanting to write this book, because becoming an author is a reinvention story in and of itself, reinventing yourself from non-author to author. But I want to go back to a little bit earlier in your story, where you were, I believe, a biology writer, or you're a healthcare writer living in DC, and you were in an unhappy marriage and maybe even an abusive marriage.
Mhm.
And in 2014, you decided to leave. Can you take me back to that time in your life and how you finally got the courage, or just you finally decided that that was it, I'm done?
Well, interestingly enough, my mother has never been outside the United States, and she travels in her mind. She only has a high school degree, but she's very progressive thinking, and she reads a lot of literature throughout the world. One of the things she wanted to do was go to Costa Rica. So I had set up a time for her to go. I knew I was at the point where I was trying to function, financially, to figure out how I was going to leave. My youngest son was already in college. It was time for me to figure out how to do that. And I was with my mother, and she actually confessed something to me about her life. And that's when I realized that this is not a new story, but that she sort of triggered me to realize, well, when, if not now, when? And so there, to a certain extent, part of her, I think, wanted me to be safe and secure and have financial security. But at the same time, she realized that it probably was a time for me to move on. And she wasn't the impetus of it, but I was a little afraid of telling her because she's been in a 70-year marriage, and I had been in a very long-term marriage, and wasn't sure what her reaction would be. But I got thinking that she's right. If not now, when? It's very
Mhm.
dangerous
And
when
how
you're leaving though sometimes because that's when you have to be the most careful, and I did have some instances. Yeah.
mhm. And how old were you when you finally decided to make that choice to leave?
I probably was like probably 56, 57, somewhere in there, yeah.
What's interesting is you told me that the book is about kind of your childhood and into your 20s,
Mhm.
but you also have had such an interesting life just from, I mean, when we had our little pre-chat, just from 2014 on, you were in your 50s onwards. Since then, you've written a book. There's all sorts of other things we're going to be talking about. So you've really, it seems like every period of your life has just been filled with interesting adventures. Um, but so back to this, because it's funny, because in my mind, you were in your 30s when this happened. I didn't realize that you're in your
In my mind,
50s.
I still am in my 30s though.
Well, I mean, you definitely look like you could be in your late
There you
30s. Yeah. So did you, was there a practical preparation to leaving? Did you feel like you had to get your finances in order, or did you just go ahead and just go for it?
That was the pragmatist in me. Despite the fact I take leaps and I do things that other people would find dangerous, I'm always very careful, pragmatic, and practical as a practical psychologist. I actually went through Montgomery County, where I live here, has a Divorce 101 course through the Women's Commission, and I was a member of the Women's Commission. And they send you through the therapy part, which is incredibly important to get your mind in the right place. The second thing is the finances, to find out where are your finances, because a lot of times, and this was true for me too, you have a joint account, but you don't have any money of your own set aside. So if you take any of that money out, particularly if you're in an abusive situation, it'll be noted and there will be abuse. So you have to be very careful where your money is and how to get it out. And then lastly, the legal issue is like one of the reasons I didn't leave earlier, I was fearful of the 50-50 custody issues that would pop up. So
Mhm.
I stayed until my kids were I mean, they're adults. I mean, they're full grown adults now and very, independent and self-sufficient. And so I didn't worry about it past a certain point. But
Mhm.
I had to actually prepare for every single one of those segments. And when I see women going through this situation, a lot of times they will use their lawyer as a therapist, and then they ring up a lot of debt. Sometimes they
Mm.
don't have their own accounts, and so it's very difficult to get the money to even pay for the lawyer. They sort of go at it in a backwards way. But particularly if you're in an abusive situation, you just have to be very careful and do all the steps. And if there's a national hotline available, if there's anything, a women's center anywhere near you, you should avail yourself of it.
Those are some great tips. So for women who are in that situation, there's a national hotline. I didn't even know that there were services that would help a woman with the divorce side of things. Is that something that is in many communities? Is this a national thing? Is this like a community level thing?
I think they're in quite a few communities. I was in the Tucson Women's Collective a very long time ago in the 70s, and they had already started something at that time. And I knew when I was in San Diego, they had a women's group. And here in the DC area, of course, this is very politically oriented because we're in DC. So we have both a women's center in Virginia and one here in Maryland that's always been very proactive. And one of those things, what a lot of people forget is that the reason no fault divorce came about was because women were getting beaten to the point of almost death when they were ready to leave because they had to prove how to get a divorce. So if you were being
Oh,
harmed, you couldn't leave because you had to prove it. And there's no way you could really prove it back in those days without cameras and hiring
right.
people and everything else. So it kept women in very violent situations. So one of the reasons that no fault divorce came through was to protect women so that they could leave without the legal ramifications of you've abandoned your children, or you've done something wrong, or you're going to get,
hmm
you're going to get hit by something or whatever. So people forget that part. That, I know there's a movement now to get rid of no fault divorce, but no fault divorce really was there to protect women in domestic violence situations.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's good to know. So you moved out, and where did you move to? This is 2014. You're in your 50s. Where did you move to?
Well, the same area. I live in Rockville at that time, and I moved here to Bethesda, essentially, because that's
Mhm.
where my job was here at that time. So
Okay.
that was the easiest way to do it. It's a nice
Yeah.
area.
Yeah. And at some point you met up with your old flame, and that's your current husband.
Mhm.
I know this story isn't about that, but it is kind of fun and
Well,
interesting
actually,
because
it is. He's on
I
page
mean, it is.
243.
I mean, it's just so cool to hear a story where so much can happen. Life can kind of
Yeah.
begin at 57 or 55 when you have done so much after the age of 55. So how did you reconnect with your current husband?
He actually had been calling me, and I had been ignoring him.
Because you were previous
We
kind
had
of
previously been
sweethearts.
together in the 90s, and we had been together in 1985, and so we'd gone through 3 rounds, so to speak, and I think his brother at our wedding put it the best when he said that this just goes to prove that true lovers nothing can part true lovers. So we
Mhm,
eventually did come back together again, so,
mhm.
now I forgot what the question was.
Oh, just how you guys got back together, how that
Um
ended up happening, like, how
Well,
you
I
ended up
think I called him
reconnecting.
up to give him the what for and kinda give him a tell him off, and instead we ended up having a 2-hour conversation. Because one thing that I've learned in all of this back and forth is that it's the friendship that probably was the most important element of our lives together, and as a matter of fact, when we discussed it with our kids, we said, "This is my best friend," and both of our kids were through abusive, and he was emotionally abused, and I had physical abuse, and I had my
Mhm,
daughter saying, once you both realize that's what's happening in your life, you're going to be a lot easier and the guilt will dissipate. And she
mhm.
was right about that. It took many, many modalities of therapy to do it, but we got there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, after having been in an abusive relationship, I can only imagine that many women would be afraid of getting into a new relationship. How
Yeah.
did you get
Mhm.
over those fears?
Yeah,
I c
yeah, because he's a very different type of person, but at the same time, I do remember at one point, I moved in 2017. There was a fight. A lot of it had to do with just I I don't want you to be like my ex, and it was in
Mm,
our minds, it wasn't what was happening, and so at one point, I just got a little crazed and like, "No, I'm never going to be harmed again." He's like, "Why would I harm you? It doesn't make any sense?" And it's just that then I realized, "Oh, this is a different person." But
mhm,
I was kind of raised during an era of back in those days, they didn't think it was abuse, but, there was using a belt, there was, welts left, black and blue marks, so on and so forth, so
I mean, when you
when
were a
you're
kid.
when I was a kid, and so what
Yeah.
happens is that the abuse gets normalized, particularly,
Mhm,
in the patriarchal way, and then when
mhm,
you get married, it's a weird psychology because not only is abuse normalized, but then it's sort of like if someone loves you, they will abuse you. So it's a
mhm.
very odd thing. So I had to make a leap into being with my best friend and someone who would never harm me ever. So,
Yeah,
yeah, this is a
and
different completely person.
yeah, so and you said you had to go through many modalities of therapy. What were some of the modalities of therapy that helped you personally?
Um, I did something called Landmark Forum, which was very popular in California at one point. And essentially, it's like stop making excuses. You still
Mhm,
have to take ownership. Yes, you were a victim, but you're not a victim. If you see yourself as a victim, you're never going to make any progress. So
Mhm.
that was a big one, and I did something called Gottman's therapy, John Gottman, and that's a couples theory. It's like a cognitive behavior therapy, which I also done, where
Mhm.
again, it's like I like the homework, you know? It's like it's
Mm.
not just I'm talk therapy, Freudian. No, I want to know this is where I am. How am I going to get there if I'm here? You know, if that means I'm going to stumble and fall. And I used to make the joke that I want to make new mistakes. I want to make more failings, only different failings, not the same failings. That's all. You know,
Yeah.
so most of the therapy had to do with, you know, how am I going to get from here to there to there? You know,
Mm.
what do I want to do next? And didn't even know what I wanted to do next.
And you found that helpful? You found
Yes.
Did you
Yes.
have any therapy that wasn't helpful? Any
Yes,
or did
I had a woman a long time ago who, she was from Argentina, and she became very involved in my life for some reason, and she decided that she needed to get deep into Freudianism, and she wanted to see me every day, and then she assumed that, you know, my father was, you know, had done this. No, that didn't happen. Just stop. And so I just I just basically
creating more drama than was even there?
yes, and my daughter was in the room when she called one time, and no, 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 no. If you want to drum up business, you know, go somewhere else, you know. But
Yeah.
it does worry me a little bit that if you have psychological harm, and that if she had come into my life at a different time, I may have been sucked into it. But because
Mhm.
I was fairly strong at that point, it was okay. But I do worry that people who might this is my advice. If you are not connecting with that therapist and you feel like there's sending you down a road of harm, take a deep breath, step back, and get out. And if they say, "Oh no, this is good for you," just definitely get out.
That's a great tip. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's great. And so, you're in a new phase of your life. You've moved out. You're with your new partner, and take me back to 2018 when you start going to a storytelling night.
I was actually with my now husband and a close friend of mine and known for many years who they said, let's go to the storytelling because they were going to both be doing storytellings, and I had listened to them and helped them a little bit. And at the end of the night, somebody said, "Was anybody like to try it?" And I thought, well, I haven't practiced, I hadn't done anything, but I had just told the same story to another friend, and he was on the floor laughing. So I said, I'll tell the story. So I got up and I told the story, and I won second place. So
That's cool. Can you
I
give a
was
little
kind of hooked.
snippet of what? Can you give a little
Yes,
snippet of what the story was?
it was a story about when I was only 18 years old. I was working on a newspaper desk at Syracuse Post-Standard in upstate New York, and the managing editor, fairly sour guy, was having an affair with a very pregnant, very sour managing the top editor over here. And I was kind of in the middle typing and getting obits out and that sort of thing. But I ran out. I didn't know this was happening. I could see them. He had a pregnant wife, was lovely. I literally liked her. I ran out the back door to catch the bus because it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. If I didn't catch the last bus, I wasn't going to make it home. And I ran down the stairs, and boom, there they were, embraced. And I went, and they went, and all of my pens and pencils went all over the place. And I was very poor at the time, so I really wanted my pens and pencils. And I ended up jumping around them. And and I was terrified. I went to a lot of older reporters who probably were in their 30s, and I was only like 18, 19 at the time, and said, I'm going to get fired. And I said, no, 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 no. You got this guy in the hook. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And so they calmed me down. But then a day later, I got a phone call saying that I would have to be let go because I wasn't putting enough research into my obits. And I took a deep breath and thought, okay, I'm going to let this guy have it because I had talked to these reporters, and, you know, and my real self kind of came out. And I said, okay, um, you are not only not going to fire me, but you're going to give me a raise. Complete silence on the other end of the phone. And then he's like, okay, why would I do that? Because I like to run out the back door to catch the bus. Click. I think, okay, I'm going to be fired. So I go to work like the next day, and there's an envelope that's thrown in front of me, and I take it into the bathroom, and I open it up, and it's I was making $1.80. This is how long ago it was, $1.85 an hour, but it was up to $2.25 an hour, big raise. And the librarian had been there. She had been there for 10 years, and she was making $2.20 an hour. And she glanced over and saw it, and she got very irate. And she said, how did you get $2.25 an hour? I only get $2.20 an hour. I've been here forever. What's going on? She said, I know. And I'm thinking, what is she going to say here? You know, because I know about the whole affair thing. And she says, it's because you got big tits. I was like, like, I thought for sure she was going to accuse me of having an affair with this guy, you know? So I kind of took my money, but put it back in my pocket and left. So
That's so funny. And that story is kind of an example because your book is The Practical Seductress,
How I learned to take my hat and run.
How I Learned to Take My Hat and Run. And the way it seems to me, it's like you're talking about the sexual double standard, but it seemed at that moment you decided, you know what, I'm going to use this I'm going to use something to my advantage. I see men using things to their
Yep.
advantage. I'm going to use a piece of information to my advantage. That was a very bold move. What made you have the balls to do that, basically?
Well, first, my father was a union organizer. He was a printer, and so I was raised with a very, these are your rights, National Labor Relations Board. So, to a certain extent, I have a very different attitude and outlook to begin with on work. I never saw work as, the company's not doing me a favor. They're making money off of me. So I had a very
Mhm.
different relationship with thinking about money and earning a living. And I really needed the job and I really need the money. So, and I also
Mhm.
thought the guy was a jerk. And so I was like, come on, I'm not going to let him get away with that.
Yeah, that's cool. And
And
so this,
yeah. Yeah. It helped
and
to have older reporters that were on my side too.
yeah, yeah. And so you tell this story at the storytelling night in 2018, and this is kind of what leads into you writing a book in your 60s. How did that then segue into you writing a book?
Um, I would COVID actually, because COVID set in, and I was had negotiated to work part time, where I was doing just training and mentoring and presentations, and that's all. So part of the day had free, and I started looking through all of my journals through my life, and writing up scenes and writing up, just thinking I'm gonna tell more storytellings or more blogs or something. And next thing I knew, I had an entire hero's journey going, which from an early age, and I tied it all in with having a daughter at the end, where I'm still not sure how I'm going to channel her through this very sexist world to survive and be tough enough to survive, and at the same time forgive me for having gone through what I went through and done what I did.
Mm.
So,
And had you always wanted to write a book, or was this something new that the idea just came to you after the storytelling night?
no, I've always wanted to write a book, and I did have a few that were up for auction when I was younger, and then I had children, and then trying to work full time and having children, and so on and so forth. And so I ended up being an education reporter for a while, and then I was writing a lot of material for the government, where you translate science for what's called the educated lay reader. So someone who has
Mm.
like a 8th grade literacy level, maybe 10th grade biology if you're lucky. Yeah, so which is
Oh,
most people. Yeah.
so your job was writing,
Mm,
obviously, your
yeah,
whole life you were
most
a
of
writer, but writing a book is a dream for many people.
Mhm.
How did you actually then just get yourself to really start? What was the beginning process like?
Um, I think I just decided to dedicate X number of hours per day and just see what comes out.
What was your daily schedule there at the beginning?
But
Because I'm fascinated by daily
yeah, I
schedules.
was working in the morning at the job until like about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I take a
Mhm.
break and meditate or exercise or whatever. And then remember, this is during COVID, so couldn't go anywhere.
Right.
And then the rest of the time, I just sat down and just wrote. That's all I did. I mean, I had like notes, I had the journals, I had all kinds of other stuff. But I thought, just from beginning to end, just write that crappy, really crappy first draft. And I mean, I had 10 revisions. It was really crappy. And so it took me about revision 3 before I realized what had happened. And when I was finishing the third revision, I had a number of beta readers. And that's when it came to me what the actual theme, the sexual double standard, and the pursuit of sexual freedom.
Mhm.
And at that time, the Dobbs decision just came out, and I was infuriated. I'm thinking, I
And
was
the
marching
Dobbs
for half a
decision, just
century. I go,
sorry, I just want to jump into, so the
yeah,
Dobbs decision was the reversal of
Roe v. Wade.
Roe v. Wade,
Right,
which is
right, which I marched in 1972 for. 1973, it passed, and I had just started college, so here I was a half a century later with the same issue, so I
mhm,
was a little I think Margaret Atwood, put it best when she said she did not write fiction, she wrote truth,
mm.
because everything that's in The Handmaid's Tale is actually something that happened in history, particularly in the United States. So so you don't even have to invent it, that's one of the reasons I wrote a memoir, is because the stuff that's happening now was happening then.
Yeah. And I believe you also told me that when you first started, you got a coach. You got some sort of
I
coach that
did.
helped you kind of break down, because
Mhm,
I'm fascinated with this as well. I always have so many projects in my life, and the even this podcast, the only way I could finally get this, something I'd had in my mind for a long time, was to break everything down in just a little tiny
mhm.
task that I accomplished. And you said that you found a coach that helped you do that. Was
I
that something that really helps you write the book?
Yes, it did because I had before I had written books and gotten 75% through them and just given up. So I
Hmm.
got a retirement coach because there were all these guides on the financial end of retiring, but there was almost in health issues. But there was nothing on the psychological. And when you've been working your whole life, you have there's a validation you get from other people. And particularly
Yeah.
for me, because I was mentoring a lot of younger people, so I was getting a lot of feedback, and I loved my job, and I loved the people who were in my job, and I had really high level professional young people. But I couldn't take that leap because I kept thinking, how am I going to get into retirement? And I really wanted to. And so she walked me through, we went through kind of like, I think it's James Clear who wrote the Atomic Habits, where, you break things down. And that was the challenge, is like every day I'm going to do this, and then
Hmm.
I'll do this, and then I'm done for the day. So
Hmm.
she got me to really, and she put my feet to the fire. And every week she would coach me and say, okay, and what did you do? How many words did you write? Where are you in this thing? And so that helped me get through. Yeah.
Mm.
And her name
For
is Sim
you,
Myers of the Rewire My Retirement, she's called, right?
rewire my retirement.
Yeah.
Okay. And so for you, what was your daily task? Was it more just based on a number of words, or like a time that you sit down, and a set number of hours that you sit down at the computer?
It was a set number of hours because I knew that but one thing I had to do is I had to actually turn off the internet. I had to take the phone
Wow.
somewhere else. I had to take the iPad somewhere else. And then I had to just look at my laptop and just turn off the internet. So I was not tempted to like do the scroll into death thing kind of thing. So
Hmm.
I had to, and you get bored, and I get bored easily. So that's one of the reasons I do my reinvention, is at some point I get very bored. Even when I'm extremely depressed, I start getting bored, and I have to do something. So I thought, I'm bored. I got to do something.
I mean, being getting bored can be a positive thing in your life,
Oh,
because it
it's a big
pushes you to
motivator.
find something to do. Yeah. So when you first started writing your book, it sounds like you were just kind of transcribing your journals. But
Mhm,
did you have a when you first started writing,
mhm.
did you know what the book was that you were writing, or was it at that point were you just kind of putting together different stories from your life?
I was just putting together different stories and trying to say, well, what happened here? Did anything happen? The most difficult part for me is to realize there's so many people in your life and there's so many chapters in your life. But
Hmm.
a good portion of that has nothing to do with the theme. Once you have the theme, I think you can't get the theme until you write the entire book. Like I wrote 137,000 words. It's down to 78,000 for the final, because it's almost like, here's the marble, where's Michelangelo in it? And not that
Mm-hmm.
not Michelangelo, I'm not the David within the Michelangelo thing,
Hmm.
but I had to write all this word salad to find out, well, what the heck is this about? And then when you have that theme clearly in mind, this is what my life has been. This is what I've been trying to achieve. This is what I'm trying to tell the next generation. I'm trying to pass the baton to a certain extent. And once that became clear, it was easy to just throw stuff out.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
have it all in a
Once
folder
you find the
someplace.
theme.
You're right.
Yeah.
Just in case.
Yeah. Love it. So you started in 2020 for the book. When did you finish the book?
I finished it in, oh my gosh, it was probably more like 2022, because I had gone through many, many revisions, and I had a lot of
Mhm.
really good beta readers, and I had actually a developmental editor who's in the area, who I knew because she was an environmental scientist, and I had worked some project with her a long time ago. So I have a lot of contacts with people, so that helped
Mhm.
considerably, so yeah.
Yeah. How did you find yourself in certain situations where you were diminished, or for example, you were in a marriage that was
Mhm,
some it could be called an abusive marriage.
mhm,
How would someone like you, at least you appear to be
mhm.
very self-assured, very spunky, very spirited, full of your own ideas. How can a woman like you find herself in situations like this?
Well, I think part of it is that it was particularly if when you have children. I thought once I had children that things would change for the better,
Mm,
and it didn't. There was a double standard there right away, because we had a semi-open marriage, quasi-open
mhm,
marriage, I call it, because it was open for him,
mm,
and it was many, many years later I found out it wasn't open for me.
mm,
So I had to deal with some of the harshness from that reality, and he traveled a lot, and he was gone a lot, and he was an oceanographer. But you once you have children, and this is probably true for a lot of women, you start self-sacrificing, or a friend of mine calls it eating burnt toast. I think it was Grace Kelly that wrote a book on her memoir, and it was called Burnt Toast, because everybody else, the husband gets the good toast, the kids get the good toast, the burnt toast you get as the mother. And
Hmm.
it's sort of like an embedded, social structure that you're born with and raised with. And
Hmm.
particularly, I'm old enough to have been raised during a time frame where we had to leave at the beaver, and what you were supposed to do as a woman, follow your man everywhere he goes, kind of thing. So I think I got trapped very much into my own belief systems. And then it's a downward spiral, because then you begin believing, well, I'm not that smart, or I'm not that good, or I'm not that talented, or I'm not that anything. And then you start, pushing how great he is and how bad you do it to yourself to a certain extent. So you can't really
Hmm.
blame the other person necessarily. You can
Hmm.
blame society or whatever, but it's a very long downward, trend, especially when you're dealing with gaslighting and, all kinds of things like that.
Hmm. And so, what were some of the things that helped you yourself break out of this double standard that maybe society, but also you yourself were putting yourself in?
Well, partly because I have a very strange sense of humor, which is a little sarcastic, so that was useful. I
Okay.
really truly believe that tragedy plus time equals comedy.
Hmm.
So that's a big one, and it's prevalent in the book too. I'm very good at taking very difficult moments and making people smile and cry at the same time. And
Hmm.
so that which is really the essence of life. And since then, I've been indulging a little bit more in Buddhism, where it's suffering is life, and by accepting that, then it makes it a little easier to get through life. Without but the hard part is knowing what to accept and not accept as you go. But I think
What do you
go ahead.
What do you think are some of the biggest sexual double standards happening now that you see women in your age group? You're in your 60s, and women, younger women, 20s, 30s, maybe 40s, 50s. What do you think are some of the main double standards that are happening?
I think in my age group, what I'm finding is this, I don't need sex anymore. I don't want sex anymore. I don't know how to deal with wanting sex anymore. It's almost they have this guilty feeling that they're in their 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they still want sex. And it's like, well, of course you still want sex, you're still alive. But, they're lubes, there are gels, there are toys, and all kinds of stuff. But so that transition seems to be difficult. So I've ended up actually, especially I have friends who actually have mothers who are closer to my age, and they're from other countries. And so in other countries it's even worse, where you're not even supposed to have an orgasm, kind of thing. So I've been sort of mentoring a lot of people in my age group as the different types of tools that they can use.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, there are these societal identities that get put onto us. When in your 20s, you can be young and fun and adventurous. When you're in your 60s, you're supposed to have now a different identity. You're supposed to become asexual. You're
Mhm.
supposed to, and
Yep.
F those identities. That's not necessarily the identity we want to have for ourselves.
I don't think it's going to work for me. So
Doesn't sound like it at all.
no, no,
Sound
I
like
enjoy it a little too much is the problem.
well, I mean, that's part of what your book is about.
Right,
And as
exactly.
you told me, you wrote a memoir at the age of 69, the perfect age to write a sex memoir. How did you get over maybe not the embarrassment, but you're writing a sex memoir
Mhm.
basically about the sexual double standard, about your own life. But was it hard for you to kind of tell people this at the beginning, to share? You said you had readers. How did
Mhm.
you get over that? I can only assume that would be at least a slight mental hurdle.
Okay, well,
That's the end of this interview so far. If you want to watch the other half of this interview or see how another woman reinvented herself over the age of 35, you can click on this next video here or on the playlist there or in the description box below. And please let me know, how would you reinvent yourself? Please write your answer in the comments below. And if you like this video, the number one way that you can say thanks to me is to hit the subscribe button and then hit the thumbs up button for this video.